For Google to say with one mouth that caste discrimination has no place in the company, and then for them to discriminate against one of the most prominent Dalit American leaders and also civil rights leaders around the issue of caste is doublespeak, because casteist, and biased companies create casteist and biased products. No talk can actually be divisive. At this point, the company is already divided about the issue of caste. So the talk isn't the problem, casteism is. And the only way that you solve that is with courage, with empathy, and with mindfulness. If by some means, like Sundar was someone raised on Mars by his family, and he never knew a single thing about caste, he certainly heard from hundreds of millions of Dalit people that caste is an issue and he needs to deal with it head on. And he's certainly hearing it from his workers. Google would never deplatform a black speaker because white nationalists decided that made them feel uncomfortable or unsafe. And we shouldn't lose heart. We should actually use this moment to, as Dr. Ambedkar says, educate, agitate, and organize.
Thenmozhi Soundararajan is an America-based anti-caste activist and a caste equity educator. Recently, Google invited her to speak about caste to its employees, but the company cancelled the talk following opposition from a small number of employees. The company's decision to deplatform a Dalit activist like Thenmozhi, who is also the executive director of Equality Labs, an Ambedkarite South Asian organization that's worked extensively on caste in US tech sector, took everyone by surprise, and it has generated a huge debate across the globe. Joining us today to speak about what really transpired is Thenmozhi herself. Thenmozhi, thank you for joining the News Minute. Everyone's talking about what happened at Google, that they invited you, then uninvited you from the talk. Could you tell us what were the sequence of events and what exactly happened?
Sure. And, thank you so much for having us, and J-Beam to all of the folks that are watching online. So, it was, a very kind of challenging set of events. And it started, in mid-March when I was approached by Google News to talk about caste in the newsrooms for Dalit History Month. And as one of the co-founders of the Dalit History Month project, that's a fairly common thing. I speak routinely at corporations and governmental bodies and universities about the issues of caste equity and Dalit history. This is actually some of the my areas of expertise as a scholar and as an advocate. So, it was a fairly kind of, normal process, particularly because I had already spoken at Google on the issue of caste 6 months prior, and that was for the Google Nextcloud Summit. And during that time, I've been very heavily vetted. They looked at my scholarship, they looked at who I was, and also even my presentation was heavily edited so that it could be in alignment with the corporate code of conduct. And their marketing goals and all of that. So, for that reason, I really didn't think there was going to be an issue. And the Google News team is a phenomenal team. They're very intentional journalists and technologists, and they seek out conversations around DEI like this because, biased companies create biased products. And so there is this huge area of growth that needs to occur, around many tech companies, around how caste impacts their workforce and impacts their products. So that's the whole origin of this talk, Now, 2 days before the talk was supposed to occur, a very small group of, employees decided to launch a disinformation and casteist, a caste bigoted campaign designed to basically shut down any conversation of caste in the company, as well as target me as an individual. And, many of those, comments were actually incredibly violent and discriminatory and unlawful in terms of, Dalit peoples, because we are a protected class, not only in South Asia, but also in the United States. Many civil rights bodies, whether it's the California Department for Fair Employment and Housing or the EEOC, which is the employment body at the federal level, they recognize caste as part of caste oppressed peoples as being protected under existing categories. So the discourse that was used in that disinformation campaign was very troubling, very discriminatory, and it was very challenging that Google News management could not discern disinformation from actual evidence-based, scholarship around who I was, my integrity, and what I bring to this work, and also that Dalits are allowed to be at the table and must be at the table when we're talking about caste. Adding more fuel to this fire, the DEI staff member who was brought into this conversation, who brought me into the company, was also targeted by bad actors who basically doxed her, which means they leaked the invite with her name and email. And that was very terrifying for them, So very quickly, this went from a disinformation campaign to a workplace safety issues because you had a staff members whose safety was compromised. And so this is where Tanuja Gupta, the manager of that employee, really kind of took on this issue and began to champion not only myself, but the issue of caste with her managers, and really tried to force the return of this talk, because it was postponed while there was an investigation. And then, after 2 weeks of inaction, Tanuja hosted like the talks we had like on her own personal handle. And she also launched an internal site inside of the company to educate all the workers as to what was going on. So, there was a site there that talked about the incidents that were happening in her department. It also introduced Googlers for the first time in a very comprehensive way to what caste was, how significant of an axis of inequity it was across South Asia. And then it also had a petition that was circulated so that Googlers could say, bring this talk back, bring Thenmozhi back. We want to learn about caste equity, and it's wrong to deplatform a Dalit civil rights leader when we have, issues to talk about. And, and so that petition went viral, the website went viral. People were very passionate about this issue and getting increasingly more disturbed about the workplace issues, particularly as more and more workers were getting targeted. And then, the opposition, the people who, were kind of resting in Savarna fragility and bigotry, they also launched a site that had libelous and, discriminatory content. And so, they called the website EL Hates Hindus, or something like EL is anti-Hindu, which was first to my org. And then they put my name, they put Thenmozhi Soundararajan is a quote, unquote Dalit, which is absolutely, you do not put anyone, especially if you're from a protected class, in air quotes. And then also, singled out like one part of my religious heritage, saying that she's a quote unquote Dalit Christian activist. And I'm very proud that I was raised both Hindu and Christian. Many Tamil Dalits are. And I've chosen to be, Buddhist now, but, there is no denigration of the religious community that I come from. And that open, bigoted content is still on Google company platforms. So this just really caused even more anger and, and really, deep feelings that there was a serious caste discrimination problem in the company. And, Google at that point could have done the right thing, but instead they actually conducted a workplace investigation against Tanuja, and that led to corrective action. And for people that don't kind of know that, HR language, it was basically a firing without a firing. Despite her being a stellar, manager and, loved by her team members across, Google, essentially this was a way for them to penalize her for doing the right thing. And I think what's really important for people to understand is that, as a manager, her responsibility is workplace safety and equity, and she was doing everything that she could to ensure the safety of people on her team, and management hung her out to dry, and so that.
If I can just interrupt, she in fact said that the reason why she called you was because 2 or 3 employees spoke to her about caste discrimination within Google, right?
That's right. And this is so, it's not a surprise to anyone who is in South Asia, but Dalits like you are very much in the closet in many of the workplaces that we are a part of because of the kind of discrimination, gaslighting, bigotry that we face. To be an openly Dalit person and train on caste DEI is one of the most difficult things that you can do, because you are always going into the lion's den and facing discriminatory, bigoted people who have not practiced a lot of mindfulness and self-awareness as to why they are so triggered that a Dalit could be at the same table as them, and speak very honestly about the exclusion that we face, and also our right to civil rights and the right to be able to access a workplace just like them, free from discrimination and harm. So after, she was given that terrible, corrective action, Tanuja, really had to kind of sit, in this moment, because she is essentially the first worker in the United States to be retaliated against for championing caste equity. And so she took a moral decision to basically share what was going on inside of the company. And she sent an email on the second to last day of her time there, about the timeline of what happened, all of the things that occurred with all of the screenshots. And it shocked the entire Google workforce, just shocked them to their core. And, I haven't seen it because it's an internal thing, but I know the one event that I was a part of with her was this like very shocking conversation with a senior Google leadership person, who is the VP for under Google News. And she said the most appalling things to me. She said things like caste is not a protected category. I also asked her, because we're all in California, and so the civil rights body here is the Department for Fairness in Employment and Housing. It's called the DFEH. And this is the body that actually, is suing Cisco right now for caste discrimination. So I just asked her, I was like, I'm really shocked. I don't understand how I was vetted and, 6 months ago, and then 2 days magically that disappeared. What are these standards? And she's like, I can't really tell you that. I said, okay, well, I'm trying to wrap my heads around what's going on here, because, we work closely with the DFEH. Our research was used in that litigation, and we provide expert testimony to institutions like the DFEH and the federal, Congress and, intergovernmental bodies. So I'm trying to understand, how are Google standards higher than the DFEH? And she said, they're not higher. They're just different. And I want people to really think about that. You have a company that operates in the state of California saying that they have separate but unequal and different standards than the law. And I really hate to break it to Google, they are not above the law here. They are actually beholden to the law. And so I think when she said that, I was so shocked that she would say something like that. And that's when she iterated, caste is not a protected category. We're not mandated to have this conversation. And I said, I would disagree. And I would say most federal bodies would disagree. And also Google is a transnational company. And you have workers who are in South Asia where caste is a protected category. And Google US routinely hires people on L1 and H1B visas from that pool. So you're creating uneven standards, so it made no sense. And then she also said this thing that was so troubling to me, because again, I kept pushing her on the standards. And she said, well, I'm really sorry. No other speaker in the history of Google has ever been treated in the way that you have. And I'm sorry about that. But that's the way things are. And then the next thing that I said, well, okay, so let me give you some examples. Would you deplatform Kimberly Crenshaw, who is this very famous Black legal scholar and activist? She developed the ideas of both critical race theory and intersectionality. And so I asked her, would you deplatform Kimberly Crenshaw because people don't want to hear about critical race theory and racial justice? And she said, no, I hope not. And I said, would you deplatform Tarana Burke if people didn't want to hear about sexual harassment? And she said, and I said, look, you did it to me. And I think that's really significant for people to understand, is that you have people who lack complete competence on this issue, making decisions that have ramifications for hundreds of millions of caste-oppressed people who know that they're setting up discriminatory standards and also setting bars that no Dalit could possibly meet. Because I told her, if you don't tell me what the standards are, and as I'm one of the few Dalit scholars in the United States who is an expert about caste in the United States and an expert in caste and tech, and I can't meet this standard, then you are setting up a situation where no Dalit will be able to come to the company to talk about the issues of caste equity. And she said, I know, it's really unfair, but that's the way things are. And I really want listeners to think about the fact that people who have power in the company are seeing open discrimination and they didn't do anything about it. So when people start to see headlines like from Google saying caste discrimination doesn't have any place in the company, and that's coming from Sundar, what I think the things that users of Google products and workers at Google and other tech companies need to realize, the issue of caste is not going to go away with PR spin. We don't need more press releases. We don't need PR spokespeople. We need policy change, and we need a real material commitment to DEI work that addresses this at the core. Because casteist, and biased companies create casteist and biased products. And so there's a serious crisis of caste, and everything that you've seen Google do on this issue has been one misstep after the other. Even in like this, conversation that was happened at an all hands deck meeting. Like, first of all, people need to know it is very, very unusual to see an all hands meeting video, audio leak in the way that it did, and all of that you could hear in that conversation, and people were extremely upset about what happened to Tanuja and extremely upset about what happened to me, and that the fact that caste was so terribly sidelined. And it really rings hollow when, Sundar, and his HR lead, HR VP, Melanie, say things like caste has no place in the company in one breath, and then in another breath still continue to deplatform a leading Dalit scholar and say things like a discussion around caste is divisive and, builds rancor. The reality is that
I want to ask about Google's reaction after this entire thing was reported. Google said that they felt this talk would actually promote divisiveness and rancor. How do you see that reaction? And did you expect this kind of backlash? Because you did go and meet people there on the invitation. You tried to explain it to them. Did you expect this kind of backlash?
Well, I think every part of Google's reaction really reflects the need that they need to do caste equity work. Frankly, very high people in leadership positions actually don't understand what caste is. They don't understand who should be at the table and are the appropriate experts to decide around how to speak about the issues of exclusion around this issue. And they embolden discriminatory disinformation, which is actually very disturbing to know that Google News senior management are not able to discern disinformation, because they're responsible for the integrity of news being shared around the world, right? But I also want to speak really directly to Sundar's comments and, Melanie Parker, his HR VP, when they talk about caste being divisive and building rancor, I want to really be clear about what we're saying here. No talk can actually be divisive. At this point, the company is already divided about the issue of caste. Its workforce is already feeling impacts of casteism across its platforms. So the talk isn't the problem, casteism is. And the only way that you solve that is with courage, with empathy, and with mindfulness. And, I just wish that Google had given Tanuja and I a chance to show them the other way, because, we have had very successful, DEI projects that we've done in other companies where people come to the table. I'm not saying that people agree all the time, but, we're not in a moment anymore where Dalits can be excluded at the table of equity, and that our stories of exclusion and discrimination and harassment can no longer be ignored. because it's not about moving at the pace of people that have hurt feelings or discomfort because of their fragility. We actually have to move around those that have been impacted by caste harm, and because these are unlawful activities, both in India and the United States. And when you're seeing such grave levels of discrimination, there are very practical policy recommendations here to address caste in the company. First and foremost, Google must add caste as a protected category. Without that protection, what happened to me could happen to any number of Google caste oppressed workers and contractors. So it needs to be there and present. Second, in the United States, they have this process when a company has exhibited great racial harm. They do this thing called a civil rights audit. And in the global South, it's called a human rights impact audit assessment. And in fact, we were one of the groups to kind of help advocate for that at Facebook because of all the discrimination that was occurring in Facebook India. So, we think that this is an excellent time to have a human rights impact audit assessment around the issues of caste and religious minorities in the company to assess the level of caste harm. Because again, because they haven't had it as a protected category, we have no idea of what kind of nonsense is happening. So we need to get under the hood. It needs to be administered with third parties so that there's accountability in the process. And then we get a sense of like what needs to change. And then the third policy recommendation would be to make strong investments around DEI measures, that would include data collection, but also, Google has in the rest of their diversity programs this philosophy of they want to approach, diversity and inclusion from cradle to career. So it's not just about getting diverse candidates through the door. It's about thinking about what does it take to create a diverse talent pool from the beginning that they are born all the way through school into the company. Imagine if they did that for caste oppressed and religious minorities, especially given the high dropout rates of Dalit peoples, the discrimination they face in IITs. If we were able to create a sustained talent development pool of Dalit technologists and religious minority technologists, the way that they consider around race, we would be in such a remarkable place, So I think that they need to make DEI investments, commensurate with what happens elsewhere in the company. And then I think they need to, on an individual level, expunge Tanuja's record from all of the negative remarks and thank her for her service. And they need to, honor their contract with me and allow me to speak, because talking about caste is the only way through this very difficult moment. And, I am hopeful that they will do the right thing. Because, we are in as difficult of a moment as we are in as a globe. I also seen tremendous capacity to heal. So I would just invite them to approach this conversation through healing and equity, and let's see, what they do next. So Google is really an outlier on this issue. So companies like Apple and Dell and Amazon have all started to add trainings on caste. And I've spoken at many companies who have brought Isabel Wilkerson and myself and other Dalit speakers and people who are experts on caste, because there's a yearning and a real urgent desire on the basis of HR to get in front of this issue so that no company becomes the next Cisco. So that's why everything that Google did in this situation was so mind-boggling, because while other companies are trying not to be the next Cisco, it's like they're trying everything to be the next Cisco. So, I still hold...
Since you use the word mind-boggling, I just want to ask you, is it even more mind-boggling that Google was not careful of the fact who leads them? And they should have been more careful because of the very fact of who leads the company.
Well, for those of us in Tamil Nadu and those of us who are South Indian, everybody, would understand that, Sundar comes from a Tambram background. And so that comes with a certain level of social responsibility with relationship to caste equity. His family comes from a context that has benefited greatly from the issues of caste. And, everyone always has their own story, and, one day I hope that I can sit down across the table from Sundar. Maybe we get some, filter coffee and we talk about like, where did we come from around caste, But the reality is that there is not a room in this conversation for him to deny how significant caste was, and I really think about this a lot, because, Sundar's from Madurai, and I don't know how much time he spent in Madurai. He might have been born there and grew up somewhere else. But as someone who worked very closely with organizations like Evidence and Kadir in Madurai, I was so shocked. As someone who's a Dalit but born in America, the thing to my American eyes, so I'm just saying this really so people understand, I was so shocked to hear the stories of activists and the kinds of social exclusion in Madurai that Dalits faced, and also the tremendous violence, and just, I met so many activists, and this is not me being like hyperbolic. I met so many very, very, very powerful activists who had, scars and wounds from knives, from where they had been attacked by Devers and other dominant caste people for simply advocating on the issue of caste equity. It's why, the work of groups like Evidence and Henry Tuffin's People's Watch is so important, because we have the documentation that we have because of those civil rights and organizations that are doing human rights documentation around the issues of caste equity. But just having spent that time in Madurai, there's no way that you grow up there and not have it, and that, my mom actually said that thing. She's like, anyone who was born in Tamil Nadu, you cannot come into our Nadu and not know. You cannot. You'd have to live in Mars and not know. But, caste is the air that we breathe in Tamil Nadu. So I think that's why this really hits very personally for people who are Tamil and South Indian, because if he was like someone from like Switzerland or Greece or the US, we could be like, okay, he really didn't know. But Sundar knows. So knowledge is actually the responsibility that he now has to sit with. He's now been given, if by some means, like Sundar was someone raised on Mars by his family and he never knew a single thing about caste, he certainly heard from like hundreds of millions of Dalit people that caste is an issue and he needs to deal with it head on. And he's certainly hearing it from his workers. So now what he does and what the company does, the ball is in their court. Will they act with courage? Will they act with empathy? Will they act with mindfulness and go another direction and lean into progress and lean into civil rights? Or will they continue to be, aligned with bigotry and aligned with hatred and discrimination? I think, and against bad business practices. That choice is in their hands. And I really hope that they do the right thing and that, we can still work together to do the right thing. But what I will not do is be silenced. And I will not let hundreds of millions of Dalit people be deplatformed from a company in which we represent the future of their market. And I really want to emphasize this. Like a lot of times, Dalit and caste oppressed people, think that we don't have an economic stake in the future of companies. But all of these tech companies are coming to India because they believe that we represent the future of the internet. Well, and they have this term called the next billion users, where the future of many digital processes are going to be decided by the people that come online today. Well, in South Asia, the last billion users are actually from caste oppressed communities because we were the last to come online. So it's just terrible business sense not to have an equity-minded framework to caste, because again, if you hire people that are caste competent and you create caste equitable workplaces, you will be able to capture the market of caste oppressed users. So this is really a moment where they could learn and really pivot to a greater place of shared prosperity, or they're going to continue to feel a lot of hurt because bigotry and discrimination is bad for the bottom line of a business. For Google to say with one mouth that caste discrimination has no place in the company, and then for them to discriminate against one of the most prominent Dalit American leaders and also civil rights leaders around the issue of caste is doublespeak. So we need to go beyond the PR and really ask for accountability. And I still believe that there is room for them to change. This is a moment where they can either, be self-reflective and grow, or they are going to hear from Dalit people from around the world who are just livid. I can't tell you how many calls I got from Dalit parliamentarians and Dalit technologists and Dalit leaders across the board. They cannot believe that Google would make a decision like this. And so, it's a very serious and grave issue, and we're going to see what happens, particularly because outside of the issue of caste, it's also a workplace issue. And this is what's really powerful about the many Googlers that are standing out right now. For people that don't know Tanuja Gupta's background, she was one of the leading Me Too advocates that ran this very powerful campaign called End Forced Arbitration. And what that refers to is sexual harassment victims that were, bringing up lawsuits and trying to hold Google accountable for the, unsafe and hostile working conditions that they faced under these harassing bosses. They were put into these conditions where they couldn't sue the company. They had to deal with arbitration, and it was very traumatic. So Tanuja led a very, very powerful battle to stop that practice. And that, coupled with a shareholders lawsuit, basically ended the practice in the company, and also, launched a policy conversation that led to a law around it in the United States. So people look at Tanuja as someone who's trusted in the company. She was there for 11 years. She was a very, loved manager, and she made tech workers safe across the sector. So for them to really treat Tanuja in this way is one of the greatest wrongs, and I will always be grateful for, encountering and working with Tanuja, even in this brief moment, because she showed moral courage in the face of discriminatory and unsafe conditions. And she chose to put herself on the line as an ally for hundreds of millions of Dalit people. And I think that, however painful the journey she has to walk now, and, she's still in the middle of challenges, I think people need to know that there are other ways to approach caste that are not about fragility, and they're not about silencing Dalit people. She really showed what it meant to be an ally, both to other workers and for caste oppressed people. And I salute her with all of my heart.
Thenmozhi, I want to combine two questions here, really. One is that what surprised me when I read the Washington Post story is that they reported on some of the opposition which came from Google employees who said they felt like they would be victims if this talk happened. So if, let's say, there was going to be a talk on gender or on race, and there was white victimhood being claimed by people, would Google have found it easy to cancel a talk on race then? And second, because you specifically work with Indian techies and Indian employees in the United States, people from oppressor caste or upper caste in India, a lot of from India who work abroad, many of them speak about racism, about being victims of racism. But when it comes to caste issues and casteism, do you find it extremely ironic, duplicitous that they turn a blind eye to this?
Many South Asians, when they immigrate to the United States, they bring caste, and caste oppressed peoples are minorities within a minority. But dominant caste people have never had to look at their, lineages through the lens of privilege. And they are very, oftentimes they don't know their history that well, and they've gotten used to dominating the narrative of what it means to be South Asian, and also are more comfortable in complicity and ahistoricalness when it comes to caste, especially in places like Silicon Valley, where people want to present themselves as the model minority. They don't want to talk about, the lineages of caste apartheid and violence that comes to that, So I think that, and that's very common, every system of exclusion, it's like that. The people of the top, appear to be in a place where they don't understand their privilege. They're just like, I don't see race, I don't see caste. And that's because they've been, their nervous systems are really wired, to put, blinders on to what's going on and what is, kind of informed and built their privilege. But you know what? I think that there are other ways to start to approach the really painful conversation around caste. And in fact, I have a book that's coming out in the fall called The Trauma of Caste, where I really spent a lot of time thinking about it because, the funny thing about caste is that it shouldn't really exist in the diaspora, right? Caste is linked to land relationships. Caste is linked to people in power. So in places like South Asia, and you take India, for example, dominant caste people run and are in the leadership of every institution, whether it's the media, the parliament, the judiciary, Congress, you name it, right? But that's not the case in the United States. So why is it here? And in Tamil, they have that idea of the mundame, right? The headless ghost. And I think caste is like that because it's a trauma. We recreate it without any thoughtfulness. It's because it's the way things have always been done, and so we just do it the same way. It's what's comfortable, it's what's safe, but it's not what's lawful, and it's not what's right. And so part of being able to have a really clear conversation about caste DEI is we need to step into the unknown and we need to step into discomfort. So sometimes that you might find that there's unsavory stories about your family and what they did with their domestic workers or in the lands that they owned. Maybe it's about owning the fact that there's caste-based sexual violence in your family or segregation in the buildings or things that you live in. When you really start to look at the material conditions of caste, which are very apparent to caste suppressed people, but dominant caste people have willfully kind of hidden, it is hard. It's hard on your nervous system. It's hard to really kind of hold the place of like, I was party to that, And that's why I think in the DEI work that we do in Equality Labs and that, I do as a mindfulness practitioner is we focus not just on facts and education about the practical system, we focus on people's nervous systems. Because what you need to do is help dominant caste people have more resilience for courageous conversations so that their nervous systems don't go spin out of control at the prospect of being in an equitable relationship with a Dalit person. This is not about anything that Dalits are doing. It's about dominant caste people being more self-reflective about their behaviors around Dalit people. And so that's how, and that is the conversation that happens around DEI, around race, and around gender and sexual orientation. So no, to answer your question, Google would never deplatform, a Black speaker because white nationalists decided that it made them feel uncomfortable or unsafe. Even though those are conversations happening in the US, corporations would never do that because they have civil rights obligations that don't allow them to do that, But I also think that, the lack of caste competency and for Google is that they actually don't know who is the right and appropriate stakeholder to talk to about caste. Do you talk to caste suppressed people, or do you talk to people who have worked against caste equity and come from dominant caste backgrounds? This is the challenge here, is that they went on the mandate of people who are opponents to caste equity and who have made tremendous bigoted and discriminatory and libelous statements about Dalit leaders and organizations and our issues. And that's Google's, liability to kind of deal with because it's absolutely wrong,
For those watching, I want to just tell you that a 2018 survey that Equality Labs had done in the United States found that out of 1,500 people they spoke to, 52% of Dalits and 25% of Shudras were worried that their caste would be outed. The survey also found that 60% of Dalits experienced caste-based discrimination and 2 out of 3 reported being treated unfairly at the workplace. Tell me, to those watching, could you explain the Cisco case, what Equality Labs did at that point of time, and how that's really a landmark decision at that time?
Well, the Cisco case is very significant because there was a complainant named John Doe. He's anonymized for his safety. He faced casteist hostile working conditions at Cisco Corporation. And, again, this is a case that's an open litigation. So, these are allegations. Although the DFEH never brings litigation that they haven't, already investigated. So I think that the fact that they found enough grounds to go to court is in and of itself like, a very strong direction to show what occurred. But essentially, John Doe alleges that at his time in Cisco, he faced tremendous discrimination. They all came from, IITs. And, as your audience knows, the IITs across India are extremely, they're dens of casteism with segregation in terms of the canteens and the housing and routine bullying and harassment of people. And in fact, the IIT, campus, which is IIT, Mumbai, that these folks in Cisco were from, there was a professor there where 2 Dalit workers tried to commit suicide at his doorstep because of the kinds of castigations and harassment he was giving them. So these are not safe places. So because of their time having been there, they knew that John Doe was Dalit, and that really was the origin of his problems. There was attempts to out his identity to other staff members. His work product was scrutinized. He faced ongoing harassment and eventually retaliation, where he was siloed more and more from his work and eventually let go of the company, attempted to be let go of the company. And during that time, he tried to ask for help. And you can read all of this. This is all public facing in the litigation documents that are there about this case. When he approached Cisco HR, they told them that caste was not a protected category. And that's why he had to go to a body like the DFEH, because these corporations were just acting out of pocket. And, it would be one thing if these companies did not have significant South Asians and didn't have offices in India and they're saying things like this, but they do. So that's why it's even more ludicrous. So when the DFEH investigated and found that there was credible civil rights discrimination, they didn't need to be experts in caste to know that the law was broken, which is why they filed suit. And so our research was used in that first filing. And then there was another part of the case around fighting, for John Doe to remain anonymous because of his fears of what could happen to him and his family. And all people need to know is look at the disinformation about me on this issue. There have been, extremely casteist, misogynist and, violent, libelous content that's out there. And I wouldn't wish it on anyone. And I think it's very much within John Doe's right to have that level of anonymity because of how bigoted, dominant caste people are in their attempts to deplatform Dalit people, especially those trying to get remedy for discrimination. So, that lawsuit was launched in 2020, and ever since then, Quality Labs, has been inundated with Dalits who've been asking for help in terms of discrimination in the caste sector, in the tech sector. So, we actually have an upcoming report where we'll be talking more about the discrimination that we're seeing across tech, but it's very serious. And so I think when we know 2 out of 3 Dalits are experiencing workplace discrimination in the United States, it's a serious problem. And so people are really working to mobilize around it. And so in the wake of Cisco, we've also seen this very powerful caste equity movement, be born. And so you have, universities like the Cal State University system, where 23 campuses in the state of California have added caste as a protected category. The California Democratic Party, one of the largest political state parties in the country, has added caste as a protected category. And we're just getting started. People are, every day we're getting new groups that want to bring this conversation to their institution. So it's a very powerful moment. And I think that people should not feel discouraged by the actions of Google. And I also want to go back to the whole reason we had this conversation, which was the vulnerability of Dalit journalists and the need for Dalit journalists to get more global awareness and connections because of the way that there's caste and the bias in newsrooms. So, there's so many opportunities for us to be able to have many, many conversations out of this moment. And we shouldn't lose heart. We should actually use this moment to, as Dr. Ambedkar says, educate, agitate, and organize. So I look forward to all of the people that are joining this movement, that want to share with Google. Like, please consider signing our form, and tell Google what you think. Also, feel free to reach out to them on social media. They need to hear from Dalits and South Asians about how critical it is that caste be discussed, and that discrimination, whether it's caste or race or gender, has no place in the company, and that workers must be protected, not retaliated against.
You have been working with the US tech sector. How entrenched is caste? Are there people who are oblivious to it? But are there also people who want to work towards addressing caste? Have you also met those kind of people?
Yes, I think that one thing people need to know is South Asians aren't a monolith, and the bigots who are against caste equity are actually very small in number. There's actually tremendous amounts of South Asians and multiracial allies that don't want to see caste in American tech companies. It creates a hostile workplace for all workers, and discrimination is just bad for the company, because biased companies create biased products. So it's also really bad business sense. So what I've seen is that when people start to engage very meaningfully around the issue of caste, they learn about, a very significant structure of exclusion that they didn't know a lot about. And they're earnest about wanting to make changes for the long term inside of the company. So I think this is one thing people should also walk away with, is that there are thousands of tech workers that are standing up for caste equity across every single company. And this issue is not going away.
Thenmozhi, we've spoken about the company, we've spoken about the movement, but personally, how has it been the last 2-3 days? Because I see a lot of vitriol, conspiracy theories as to why was Thenmozhi the only person deplatformed. There must be some reason. There are so many theories that people are circulating, so much of abuse. What has it been for you the last 2-3 days?
It is terrible to be the target of bigoted and misogynist disinformation. But I also think that there is no woman of color in the world that is not facing these attacks that are meant not just to deplatform us from the platform, but deplatform us from democracy. But that's one of the main reasons why I became a researcher of caste and tech, because these are not just issues that have to do with algorithms and apps. These actually have to do with our rights, and then the future of where Dalit women get to be part of a conversation. And so, while I try to, avoid and practice self-care in the face of these bigoted remarks, again, I put the responsibility of addressing this right back at Google. And I've been very, very lucky that at the same time as there's disinformation by bigots, there's also a tremendous amount of love and support from within the Ambedkarite community and caste abolitionists all around the world. And I think that's what we need to really understand. We are in a deeply polarized time, but there are people of moral courage everywhere, whether they're inside of Google or on the streets in Chennai or in our homes and family networks. Everywhere that we are as South Asians, people know that the time to talk about caste and to break the silence about the wound of caste is now. And we need to wake up to the trauma that it is and start to address it like the serious structural problem that it is, and be unapologetic in the ways that we center Dalit people, in the way that we heal from caste.
I'm going to end the conversation with a final question to you, Thenmozhi. Because of this entire controversy, a lot of people in India are talking about caste abroad. Should the conversation be at all there? Should we talk about caste abroad? Because many behave as if you leave caste behind when you leave India's shores. So how important do you believe is it talking about caste abroad? What have the challenges been for Equality Labs and for you personally? And where do you see this journey going?
Well, caste is the air that we breathe. Everywhere South Asians go, they take caste with them. And it is certainly there, endemic across every institution in South Asian society. So I think that being able to talk about it in the diaspora is a little bit more freer, because we don't have the level of censorship and gatekeeping that exists in the media, that exists in South Asia, to prevent real conversations about caste that look at structural answers to this problem. So I think that it's important that we use the conversations in the diaspora for people to ignite conversations right where they're at. Because you'll see caste in your interpersonal relationships, caste in the corporations that you might be a part of, caste in terms of elections. It's there everywhere. And I think that if anything positive comes out of this is that there's permission to not only talk about caste, but also to heal from it. And that we have ways that we can build intercaste, interfaith, multiracial alliances to put this demon to bed once and for all. And I want to be very clear here. The opposite of caste equity is only bigotry. Talking about caste equity does not target any one particular faith. Caste is found in all religious communities in South Asia. So it's kind of a way to deflect, to kind of highlight, this is an attack on any religious community. And, I think in doing so, it's a way to, again, re-abuse Dalits from being able to talk about these issues. So, Equality Labs is committed to holding the course, around caste equity. And we are joined by many, many global partners in the battle for ending caste apartheid around the world. And as this incident has shown us, Dalit people are not alone. We are joined by the world in our fight for human rights and for equity. And I just encourage everyone listening to join us.
Thank you so much, Thenmozhi, for speaking to us. And yes, we will wait and see how Google reacts. Are they going to take this moment to really undo what the damage that is already being done? Are they going to say that we as a company will take a stand? The world is really watching. Thank you, Thenmozhi.
Yes, the world is also watching, but also there are lawful requirements that they must do at this time. So I don't want to hear any more PR spin. It's just about the policy change right now. So let's see what happens. And I'll be there eating my popcorn, hanging out with all the people who are fighting for their rights. And I want to salute all of the Googlers that are fighting right now, because it is an unsafe working condition. Because if Tanuja can be retaliated against, any worker can be retaliated. And so the fact that Googlers are showing such tremendous courage, I just want to thank them. I want to thank the Alphabet Workers Union and tech workers around the world that are standing up, because this is our time. And I believe and I know that we're going to win. So thank you.
This is our time, and these are conversations that we're supposed to have. Thank you so much, Thenmozhi.